June 13, 1886. Lake Starnberg, Bavaria. Two bodies float face down in the dark water. One is Ludwig II, the so-called Mad King of Bavaria. The other is his doctor. Both are dead. Under mysterious circumstances, just 3 days after Ludwig was deposed on charges of mental incompetence. You're standing at the edge of one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The man who created the fairy tale castles that would inspire Disney's most iconic creations lies dead in these cold waters, taking his secrets with him to the grave. But this isn't just the story of a king's mysterious death. This is the story of how impossible dreams and dark secrets created the fairy tale castles that would inspire Disney while driving a kingdom to the brink of collapse. How a romantic prince became the Mad King. How beauty and madness intertwined to create monuments that would outlast empires. What really happened on that June night? Was it suicide, accident, or something far more sinister? Why did the man who built the world's most beautiful castles become known as the Mad King? And what dark secrets were hidden behind those magnificent walls? The answers lie buried in Bavarian archives, whispered in castle corridors, and encoded in letters that were meant to never see daylight. This is the true story of Ludwig II, a tale of forbidden love, political conspiracy, impossible dreams, and a death that shocked Europe. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the king, whose architectural dreams live on in every Disney castle. The fairy tale is about to become a nightmare. Before we dive into this forgotten story, hit that like button if you're ready to uncover the truth, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love connecting with fellow history enthusiasts from around the world. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must travel back 22 years earlier to a time when Ludwig II was everything a fairy tale prince should be. In 1864, Ludwig II ascended to the throne of Bavaria at just 19 years old. Tall, strikingly handsome, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold the romance of a bygone era. The Bavarian people called him Der Hahn König, the fairy tale king. He possessed everything: beauty, intelligence, and a passionate devotion to the arts that set him apart from the mundane politicians of his time. Unlike his contemporaries who saw kingship as a game of power and politics, Ludwig viewed his crown as a sacred trust to preserve beauty and culture. He was a dreamer in an age that increasingly demanded pragmatists, a romantic soul born into a world growing ever more cynical. The encounter that would define Ludwig's destiny came in 1864 when he discovered the music of Richard Wagner. This wasn't merely royal patronage. It was a spiritual awakening. Ludwig didn't just support Wagner financially. He became completely consumed by the composer's mythological operas, especially the tale of Lohengrin, the noble swan knight. Wagner's music offered Ludwig something the real world couldn't: a realm where beauty triumphed over politics, where noble ideals mattered more than compromise, where a king could be a hero rather than a bureaucrat. But this obsession would prove to be both Ludwig's greatest inspiration and his most dangerous escape. Reality, however, had other plans. In 1866, Bavaria suffered a crushing defeat in the Austro-Prussian War, forcing Ludwig to align with Prussia, the very kingdom that threatened Bavarian independence. For a young king who believed in honor and sovereignty, this political submission was a devastating blow. The idealistic prince who had imagined himself ruling a proud independent Bavaria suddenly found himself little more than a vassal to Prussian power. The contradiction between his romantic ideals and harsh political reality began eating away at his soul. Then came 1867. and what many consider the crucial turning point in Ludwig's life. He became engaged to Princess Sophie, sister of Empress Elizabeth of Austria. The match seemed perfect. Sophie was beautiful, intelligent, and genuinely fond of Ludwig. But just months after the engagement was announced, Ludwig abruptly broke it off without providing any satisfactory explanation. The court was shocked. Sophie was publicly humiliated and rumors began to circulate. In private letters discovered years later, Ludwig wrote haunting words. "I cannot love in the way the world expects. I am cursed to live alone." This broken engagement wasn't just a personal failure. It was a rejection of the most fundamental royal duty, securing the succession through marriage and heirs. Something was deeply wrong. Something Ludwig couldn't or wouldn't explain to anyone, not even himself. The fairy tale prince was beginning to crack, and the cracks would soon become chasms that would swallow everything in their path. Those cracks would soon be torn wide open by the catastrophic events of the early 1870s, transforming Ludwig's personal struggles into a complete retreat from reality. The Franco-Russian War of 1870–71 marked the death of Ludwig's dreams and the birth of his obsessions. Bavaria was forced to fight alongside Prussia against France. And when the smoke cleared, Ludwig faced the ultimate humiliation. He had to sign the treaty that absorbed Bavaria into the newly formed German Empire. In a single night, Ludwig lost the real independence of Bavaria forever. He was no longer the sovereign king of a proud nation, but merely a ceremonial figurehead under Kaiser Wilhelm III of Germany. For a man whose entire identity was built on romantic ideals of kingship and sovereignty, this political castration was unbearable. The fairy tale kingdom he had dreamed of ruling was now just a province in someone else's empire. This is when Ludwig began his true escape from reality. He started avoiding official ceremonies, refusing to meet foreign dignitaries and spending hours alone in his chambers listening to Wagner's operas on endless repeat. The crown that had once represented his sacred duty now felt like a prison. And Ludwig was determined to build his own world where he could be the king he was meant to be. In 1869, just before this political catastrophe, Ludwig had begun construction on what would become his most famous creation, Neuenstein Castle. But this wasn't just architecture. This was Ludwig's attempt to recreate Wagner's mythological world in stone and mortar. The castle was designed as a monument to Lohengrin, the Swan Knight, with soaring towers and rooms decorated with scenes from Wagner's operas. Ludwig envisioned himself as the noble Swan Knight ruling from a perfect fortress above the clouds, untouched by the compromises and humiliations of the real world. Every detail was carefully planned to transport him into the mythical realm where honor still mattered and kings were heroes, not bureaucrats. Simultaneously, he began constructing Linderhof, a smaller but completely isolated palace where Ludwig could indulge his increasingly strange habits. Here, he could live entirely according to his own rules, dining alone at tables set for multiple guests, conversing with portraits of long-dead royalty and maintaining a completely inverted schedule, sleeping during the day, and living his fantasy life under cover of darkness. Court observers began noting Ludwig's transformation from an engaged, if eccentric, young king into something far more troubling. He would walk the palace corridors alone at midnight, holding animated conversations with the painted figures on the walls, as if they were his only trusted advisors in a world that had betrayed him. But Ludwig's retreat into fantasy was far from over. In 1878, those midnight conversations with portraits would evolve into something far more elaborate and disturbing. A complete recreation of the court of Louis XIV played out. With an audience of one. Heron Chimps was Ludwig's most ambitious and most telling project. A perfect replica of Versailles built on an island in the middle of Lake Chiemsee. This wasn't mere architectural imitation. It was the physical manifestation of Ludwig's new obsession with Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. Ludwig had begun to see himself as the Bavarian Sun King, destined to rule with the same absolute authority and magnificent splendor as his French idol. But here's where Ludwig's story becomes truly surreal. The palace servants who worked at Heron's left behind accounts that read like scenes from a fever dream. Picture this. A dining hall stretching 165 feet. With a table set for 20 guests in the finest china and crystal. The chandeliers blazed with electric light. Cutting-edge technology for the era. Everything was prepared with meticulous precision for a grand royal banquet. Except there was only ever one guest, Ludwig himself. Night after night, he would dine alone in this vast hall, raising toasts to imaginary courtiers from Louis XIV's era, laughing at jokes only he could hear, and issuing orders to phantom servants from a long-dead ad court. The real servants watched in silent horror as their king conducted elaborate conversations with empty air, treating his delusions as if they were more real than the flesh and blood people who served him. The palace itself was a technological marvel. Electric lighting throughout, central heating, even an elevator. But all of this innovation served a deeply disturbing purpose, creating a perfect controllable world, where Ludwig could be the absolute monarch he believed himself to be, free from the constraints of reality, politics, or human relationships. The financial cost was staggering. By 1880, Ludwig had accumulated debts of over 14 million marks, a sum that threatened to bankrupt not just the royal household, but the entire kingdom of Bavaria. He was borrowing from private banks at ruinous interest rates. And there were whispers that he had even considered selling his beloved castles to Russia or the Ottoman Empire to pay his creditors. But money was becoming irrelevant to a man who had already purchased his own private universe, where he was not just a king, but a god among his imaginary subjects. But Ludwig's financial recklessness was only one part of a much darker picture that was about to emerge. Behind the magnificent walls of his fairy tale castles, the king was harboring secrets that could destroy not just his crown, but his life itself. In the conservative society of 19th-century Europe, while Ludwig played God among his imaginary courtiers, he was also living a double life that would have scandalized his subjects and provided his enemies with the perfect weapon to destroy him. The king who refused all marriage proposals, who broke his engagement without explanation, was hiding relationships that went far beyond the bounds of royal propriety. Since the early 1870s, Ludwig had maintained an intensely close relationship with Richard Hornig, a strikingly handsome young man who worked in the royal stables. Court records show that Ludwig spent entire days in the stables, often requesting that Hornig accompany him on private trips to his various castles. What raised eyebrows among court observers were the extraordinary bonuses and expensive gifts that Hornig received, far beyond what any stable hand could expect. Even more telling were the coded letters discovered years later between Ludwig and Hornig, written in a cipher using the pet names Elsa and Heinrich. Line of attack. In the rigid moral climate of 19th-century Bavaria, even unfounded rumors of improper relationships could destroy a monarch. And Ludwig's enemies knew they now had a weapon that could obliterate him completely. The Bavarian government, under intense pressure from Berlin and foreign creditors, began to seriously consider the unthinkable, removing Ludwig from the throne. They needed legal justification that would satisfy both domestic and international observers. And Ludwig's mental state became their primary weapon. Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, a prominent psychiatrist, was secretly commissioned to evaluate Ludwig's mental fitness. In an unprecedented breach of medical ethics, Gudden prepared his diagnosis without ever actually examining the king. Instead, he relied on testimonies from court officials who had clear political motivations to support a finding of insanity. The resulting report declared Ludwig to be suffering from paranoia and incapable of ruling. The document was signed by witnesses who had minimal contact with the king, making it legally questionable but politically convenient. Modern historians note that the entire process resembled a show trial more than a medical evaluation. In his final months of freedom, Ludwig became increasingly aware that his enemies were closing in. He began burning letters, destroying personal documents, and even considering fleeing Bavaria altogether. The irony was bitter. Ludwig's paranoia about conspiracies against him was turning out to be completely justified. The conspiracy Ludwig had feared was about to become reality. On June 10, 1886, a delegation arrived at Novenstein with a document that would shatter the fairy tale forever. Ludwig II was officially deposed, declared mentally incompetent to rule based on Dr. Gudden's fraudulent evaluation. The man who had built castles in the clouds was being brought down to earth with devastating finality. The scene at Novenstein that morning was one of profound tragedy. Ludwig's loyal servants, many of whom had served him for decades, wept openly as they watched their beloved king being informed of his fate. The delegation led by Count Krashim delivered the news with bureaucratic coldness, reading from prepared statements as if they were announcing a routine administrative change rather than destroying a man's life. Ludwig received the news with a dignity that surprised even his enemies. There were no tantrums, no protests, no desperate attempts to rally supporters. Instead, he simply asked, "So, they have finally done it?" When told he would be taken to Kasselberg for medical treatment, Ludwig's only response was haunting in its resignation. "They can take my crown, but they cannot take my dreams." But behind this composed exterior, witnesses later reported that Ludwig's hands trembled as he signed the documents, and his eyes held a look of profound betrayal. He had spent his entire reign trying to avoid the brutal realities of politics only to discover that politics had finally cornered him in his own fairy tale castle. The journey from Novenstein to Kasselberg was conducted under heavy guard, as if Ludwig were a dangerous criminal rather than a deposed monarch. The irony was bitter. The man who had spent years avoiding public appearances was now being paraded through Bavaria under armed escort. His humiliation complete and public. The 3 days Ludwig spent at Kasselberg were described by observers as both tragic and eerily peaceful. The deposed king seemed almost relieved that the pretense was finally over. He spent his time writing final letters, most of which he immediately burned, and staring out at Lake Starnberg, as if contemplating something only he could see in those dark waters. During these final days, Ludwig's behavior became increasingly contemplative. He asked detailed questions about the lake's depth and currents, requested maps of the shoreline, and made cryptic comments about finding peace beneath the waves. The guards, trained to watch for signs of suicide, noted these conversations, but failed to grasp their significance until it was too late. Dr. Gudden, meanwhile, had arrived at Kasselberg with his own agenda. The psychiatrist who had diagnosed Ludwig without ever meeting him now found himself face to face with his patient for the first time. Contemporary accounts suggest that Gudden was shocked by what he found. Not the raving madman he had described in his reports, but a lucid, articulate man who seemed perfectly aware of his circumstances. In private conversations with other staff members, Gutton reportedly expressed doubts about his own diagnosis. He had expected to find a patient lost in delusions, but instead encountered a man who spoke clearly about his situation, showed no signs of the paranoia that had justified his deposition, and demonstrated a sharp understanding of the political forces that had destroyed him. On the evening of June 13, 1886, Ludwig requested permission to take a walk around the lake with Dr. Gudin. The guards were instructed to follow at a distance to give them privacy. A decision that would haunt everyone involved. At 6:30 p.m., the two men set out on what would become one of history's most mysterious final journeys. What happened during those final hours remains one of the great mysteries of European history. The last witness to see them alive was a local fisherman who reported seeing two figures walking along the shoreline engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. Ludwig was gesturing dramatically while Gudin seemed to be trying to calm him down. When they failed to return by 10:30 p.m., search parties were hastily organized. The delay in launching the search would later be criticized as criminally negligent. For crucial hours had passed before anyone began looking for them. At 11:30 p.m., both bodies were discovered floating in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg. Ludwig's pocket watch had stopped at 6:54, but whether this marked the time of death or simply when the watch became waterlogged remains unclear. The scene that greeted the searchers was as mysterious as everything else in Ludwig's life. Dr. Gudin's body showed clear signs of a violent struggle. Scratches, bruises, and what appeared to be defensive wounds on his hands and face. His clothing was torn, and there were marks on his throat that suggested a desperate fight for life. But Ludwig's corpse appeared almost peaceful, as if he had simply lain down in the water to sleep. Even more puzzling were the physical positions of the bodies. Ludwig was found floating face down about 20 m from shore, while Gudin was closer to the beach, suggesting he had been trying to reach safety. Yet, both men were found in water that was barely chest deep, hardly a drowning hazard for two grown men under normal circumstances. The official investigation was rushed, sloppy, and suspiciously brief. No proper autopsy was performed despite the mysterious circumstances. The scene wasn't preserved or thoroughly examined. Key witnesses were never properly interviewed, and Ludwig's personal effects mysteriously vanished before they could be catalogued. The Bavarian government seemed desperate to close the case as quickly as possible, leading to speculation that they were hiding something. Local residents who participated in the search later reported strange details that never made it into the official record. Ludwig's coat was found neatly folded on a rock as if he had carefully prepared for swimming. But his boots were still on his feet, and his pockets contained valuables that any suicide victim would have removed. Most mysteriously, there were no signs of a struggle on the shoreline, despite the evidence of violence on Gutton's body. 3 theories emerged from that tragic night, each with its own disturbing implications. The suicide theory suggested that Ludwig, devastated by his deposition, had attempted to drown himself while Gudin died trying to prevent it. The accident theory proposed that Ludwig, unfamiliar with swimming in the cold lake water, suffered cramps and drowned, with Gudin dying in a rescue attempt. But the murder theory, while lacking definitive proof, pointed to troubling evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. Ludwig was known to be a strong swimmer. Yet the water where the bodies were found was only waist deep. The violent injuries on Gudin's body suggested a life and death struggle, not a peaceful drowning. Most suspiciously, Ludwig's death immediately solved multiple problems for his enemies. The debt crisis, the political embarrassment, and the dangerous secrets that could no longer be exposed. The truth died with them in those dark waters, leaving behind only questions that would echo through history. But perhaps the greatest irony of Ludwig's story wasn't how he died, but how spectacularly wrong his enemies were. About his legacy. The castles they dismissed as the expensive fantasies of a madman would become Bavaria's greatest treasures, generating more wealth than Ludwig ever spent building them. The transformation of Ludwig's reputation from mad king to visionary genius didn't happen overnight. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Bavarian officials were so embarrassed by the scandal that they considered demolishing Novenstein Castle entirely. The unfinished structure was seen as a monument to royal excess and mental instability, a physical reminder of the crisis that had nearly bankrupted the kingdom. But as the 19th century drew to a close, something remarkable began to happen. Tourists started arriving in Bavaria, drawn by curiosity about the mysterious king and his fairy tale castles. What they found exceeded their wildest expectations. Novenstein, even in its incomplete state, was breathtaking. A perfect fusion of medieval romanticism and cutting-edge 19th-century technology. The castle featured innovations that were decades ahead of their time. Electric lighting when most of Europe still relied on gas lamps, central heating systems that kept the enormous structure warm even in Bavarian winters. And even flush toilets. Luxury amenities that many royal palaces wouldn't possess. For another generation. Ludwig's madness had apparently included a remarkably practical vision of modern comfort. By the early 1900s, what had been derided as wasteful spending was being recognized as incredible foresight. The German Empire, initially embarrassed by Ludwig's legacy, began to embrace the economic potential of his creations. Tourism revenue started flowing into Bavaria, providing jobs and prosperity for thousands of families. The mad king's investments were paying dividends beyond anything conventional economic planning could have achieved. Today, Novenstein alone attracts over 1.3 million visitors annually, bringing in hundreds of millions in revenue. The wasteful project that supposedly bankrupted Bavaria has become one of the most profitable tourist attractions in the world. Ludwig's financial recklessness turned out to be an inadvertent stroke of economic genius that continues to benefit Bavaria more than 130 years after his death. But Ludwig's influence extended far beyond Germany's borders. His architectural vision would eventually reshape the entire concept of fairy tale aesthetics around the world. The romantic medievalism he pioneered influenced Art Nouveau designers, Hollywood set designers, and architects across Europe and America. His castles became the template for how Western culture visualized the perfect fairy tale setting. Even more remarkably, Ludwig achieved a form of immortality he never could have imagined. In the 1950s, Walt Disney visited Novenstein and was instantly captivated by its fairy tale architecture. Sleeping Beauty Castle at Disneyland was designed directly from Ludwig's creation, transforming what critics called a madman's dream into the global symbol of magic and wonder. This connection between Ludwig and Disney represents one of the most extraordinary cultural transformations in modern history. The lonely king who dined with imaginary courtiers became the indirect architect of an entertainment empire that brings joy to millions. His vision of perfect magical worlds once dismissed as evidence of mental illness became the foundation for theme parks, movies, and countless childhood dreams. Millions of children who have never heard of Bavaria or Ludwig II have been enchanted by his vision filtered through Disney's interpretation. The king, who was mocked for living in a fantasy world, created fantasies that continue to inspire joy across generations and continents. His castles, appear in everything from Disney movies to video games, ensuring that Ludwig's artistic legacy reaches virtually every corner of the globe. Modern psychological analysis suggests that Ludwig was far from the madman his enemies portrayed. His extensive correspondence reveals clear thinking and logical reasoning. He successfully managed incredibly complex architectural projects that required sophisticated planning and execution. His isolation and eccentric behavior might have been responses to impossible social pressures, rather than symptoms of genuine mental illness. The diagnosis of paranoia that justified his deposition looks increasingly suspect when examined through contemporary psychiatric standards. Ludwig's fears about conspiracies against him proved to be entirely accurate. His supposed paranoia was actually well-founded awareness of real threats. The medical evaluation that destroyed him was so ethically compromised that it would be inadmissible in any modern court. Recent historical research has revealed the extent to which Ludwig's deposition was driven by political and financial motivations rather than genuine concern for his mental health. The Bavarian government was under enormous pressure from Berlin to resolve the debt crisis, and removing Ludwig provided a convenient scapegoat. The king's eccentric behavior gave them the pretext they needed, but the real motives were far more calculating. Many questions about Ludwig's life and death remain unanswered, and perhaps that's fitting for a figure who lived so much of his life in mystery. We may never know the exact nature of his relationships with Hornig, Paul, and the opera singers. The contents of the letters he burned will remain forever unknown. The true circumstances of his death, whether accident, suicide, or murder, continue to be debated by historians and criminologists. But these mysteries only add to Ludwig's enduring fascination. He represents something that resonates across cultures and centuries, the individual who refuses to compromise their vision, even when the world declares them mad. In an age of increasing conformity and pragmatism, Ludwig's insistence on beauty, wonder, and impossible dreams feels both tragic and inspiring. What we do know is that Ludwig too represents a tragic figure caught between eras. A romantic idealist in an age of pragmatic politics. An artistic genius constrained by financial realities. A man seeking authentic self-expression in a society that demanded rigid conformity. His story reminds us that visionaries are often misunderstood by their contemporaries and that today's madness might be tomorrow's genius. Perhaps Ludwig wasn't the mad king after all, but simply a dreamer born in the wrong time, whose dreams were too beautiful for his world to understand until it was too late to appreciate the man who created them. His legacy suggests that sometimes the greatest gift we can give future generations is the courage to pursue impossible dreams, even when the world calls us mad for dreaming them.